general question. You talk about the need for a cultural revolution to change values and maybe question the traditional male gender stereotype role. Are there any structural changes in society that would be important to abolish violence towards women? For instance, the growing disparity between rich and poor, the fact that women are paid less than men, they're often economically dependent upon men. What structural changes might be beneficial to liberate women from that level of economic dependence?
There's evidence of countries where there are clear differentiations between males and females, and males and female roles tend to have more violence, or it's more common. Certainly the overt violence. I'm not sure about the controlling violence and things there. But you can't just say that, because I know women who are very well off, who are very comfortably off, who have high paid positions, and they are victims of domestic violence. It's much more subtle and much more complex than that. Certainly not having the resources, being paid less and so on will do it. But that's not going to change things, because it's about the power relationships within households. And sometimes, and I can quote that from my own experience, men who are not the main income earners, who don't have any power in the household, sort of take it out on the women in other sorts of ways. So, it's not just financial. It's one thing, one of the hard lessons I think people on the left have got to learn is that material differences don't necessarily create the entire problems. I just think we've got to do it. I'd like to ask a question of the men in this room. How many men in this room would actually have a conversation about their attitudes towards women when they're sitting around with other men? Don't all rush to tell me at once. I'm serious about that.
No. We had one just now.
The gentleman opened up. We've had a few discussions.
Yeah, I know, but you're doing it here and we're in a mixed group, but it's quite interesting that men don't talk. That's one of the powerful things that came out of this particular piece of research, was men talking to other men about their attitudes to women. And I suspect that most men don't talk about those sorts of things with other men. It's not something which is a general part of the general conversation, and that's, I suppose, what we want to start getting people to talk about why you feel, whether you feel hostile, when you feel angry, when you feel things, to talk about whether or not who controls the money and who controls various things there, to try and get conversations going, which make it clear that a lot of men do feel fairly uncomfortable about it. One of the interesting things I said that came out of the stats I was looking at this afternoon was people were more comfortable with equality in the workplace than they were with equality in the home. So I just think we've got to actually look at that, to look at the divisions of housework, to look at who controls the money, to look at who controls, the various decision-making type things. And a lot of women go along with it because they think that that's, the right thing to do in many cases. And we've got to start looking at it from that angle, because a lot of men will turn around and say things like, but I never hit her, so I'm not involved in domestic violence. No, but you sort of control the money, you control the budget, you control what's going on. And sometimes you do that even though you're not the main income earner. Even there where there's a more equitable income earning type things. And the women in those situations who are often things are far too embarrassed to start talking about it, so they don't tell anybody. There's a lot of silence around this sort of stuff. But yes, having a more equal society would help in a lot of ways, but I'm not convinced it would actually cure domestic violence. I think
maybe we can look at alternatives to the traditional family structure, more collectivist modes of living.
Yeah, we tried that in the 70s, and we had this neoliberal crap that came up, and now we sort of seem to be much back to the nuclear family.
Yeah, maybe we could break away from that.
Yeah, I think that would help, because obviously the more open in some cases it is, the less the controlling behaviour can happen. I still think there's a lot of bashing. You've only got to look at some indigenous communities and things where there is a level of even public violence. But I think the sort of privatisation of the family does make it worse. And particularly when you live in ever bigger houses and don't talk to your neighbours, because nobody ever walks down the street with them.
For women and children.
Yeah. And just on that, the fact that we've now just managed to get, which I haven't heard sufficient protest about, that they've just changed the children's services funding, or they're trying to change the children's services funding, so if you don't have a job, your kids can't get childcare subsidies unless you're labelled as a deficit. And I'm sorry, kids need childcare if only to get away from parents sometimes that are sort of fighting. And we've just got to get away, and why have we turned a community service into a commercial service which has only got an economic outcome? So So I think there's a lot of things that we're getting worse about that sort of stuff rather than better.
I was in Cuba last year, which is a socialist country, and I met quite a lot of Spanish people, a lot of Spanish women, who were preferring to travel in Cuba rather than the rest of Latin America, which has a very strong reputation for male chauvinism. And I guess Cuba used to have that too, but it doesn't seem to anymore. These women said that, but they're not necessarily socialists, but they're getting away from the dog-eat-dog capitalist society to a different society, and they noticed that without necessarily intellectualising it into socialism or anything else. So do you think this is going to have an effect on reducing domestic violence in Cuba over the years?
I'd like to talk to some Cuban women and find out how much change there has been, because you said a lot of South America has a very dicey reputation in terms of male-female relationships.
This wasn't so much a question, just about homosocial discussion amongst men. My guess would be to say, I don't know of any particular research on it, but I'd say that the defining nature of ordinary Australian homosocial conversation is precisely not about feelings or relationships. And this funny cultural phenomenon that we call sport or politics, and maybe betting or something for older men. We take it for granted that that's a worthy topic or something, but there's a mighty absence of. It's not uniquely Australian. I mean, there's British comedy set-ups sometimes which have two men talking to each other, who've known each other for 45 years, and oh, how are you? And the other guy says after about half an hour says, a bit sad, my wife died, and you're that day, are you? Yeah, that's sort of to the degree of isolation.
I mean, we just need to understand a lot more. Men need to understand a lot more about what the sort of triggers are for those sorts of behaviours, and we just don't have that sort of data. Nobody looks at it.
Eva and I were talking before about how, and I'm sure you would have this experience as well. In my work at Leichardt Women's, I'm aware of a lot of women who are in very controlling, abusive relationships, and I'd say that from what we know of those situations, based on what the women tell us, is that she knows, he knows, if there are children in the house, they know, and sometimes there's someone close to her who's observed it, in passing, in an interaction, in something. But generally, it's still very, very private. And so I was saying to Eva, how do we find out more about what men are thinking if it's still such a very private situation? And men, as you say, just talk about sport. And look, I've never understood that. These really in-depth conversations about balls and goals and things. Anyway.
It's about being masculine.
Well, yeah, but what is it about being masculine?
But men can't listen to what we really want to say. I'm a bit dull to hear. Yeah, so it's a gender idea. Yeah, men talk. It doesn't always.
But lots of men like women talk, unless they're pretending. Yeah. But a lot of women don't really like men talk that much, I don't think. Some do. Generalisations flying around here.
This was probably 2004. I heard from a Sydney-based psychotherapist who saw a lot of couples. He was a relationship counselor, and what he told me, I was so surprised. He said, all this, you know, what's going on, women, yes, we hear from the media of women being bashed and so on, but I meet people and there's so much controlling from women, but they are controlling in a different way, through speech, through withholding affection and so on, or through silent treatment or whatever. So that part we don't hear at all, and somehow men don't pick it up, or they don't think of it really, so they just know something is wrong and they hit. It's kind of primitive response, but so women are more conscious of what they are doing, but this is not being heard, or not that we know the general society. So that's one person who told me that, and I haven't heard about that since. So what do you say to that?
Well, I would say that in the case of domestic violence, there's really no excuse. It's not because you're nagging, or it's not because, you know, you're doing something in particular. That's usually just an excuse for an excuse for a behaviour that's going to happen anyway. Can women be annoying? Absolutely. We can be very annoying. And we can be, I think, another generalisation, but hard taskmasters. And I'm sure some women are very difficult to live with. But that doesn't mean that they create the environment that becomes control and abuse, financially, emotionally, physically, sexually. I mean, it's much more complicated than that. And women often blame themselves and for, you know, if only I didn't do that, if only I served the dinner more hot, if only I was thinner, if only I wasn't so thin, if only, you know, if only. None of it, it's nothing actually really about her. It's all about him and what's happening to him and what's happened to him. Because if she hasn't set him off that night, something will set him off the next night. It's not really about what she's doing.
I think, sorry?
Isn't there two sides of the story?
Look, I mean, there are two sides of lots of stories. I'm not pretending that women are saints and women always behave well. They certainly don't. There are situations where men are more physical and women are more verbal, and sometimes I think that causes can cause serious tensions. I think what we're talking about here is not the sort of marriage tensions that people often get, but it's the sort of situation where one member of the party, and sometimes it can be women, but much less so than men, actually control the situation, control the emotional situation, control the financial situation, and completely undermine the other person's capacity to make any decisions and so on. We're not talking about the fact that some people just don't get on and won't get on, and some women are bitches and some blokes are monstrous, etc., etc. We're talking about the unhealthy relationships where somebody has no control over their money, no control over their lives, no control over where they go, where they get cut off from their friends, get cut off from their family, get do those things there. We're not talking about the fact that, you know, that they have the occasional screaming matches and behave abominably towards each other. I think that's a different set of things like that. But unfortunately what people tend to do is to say, she drove me to it because she really irritated me. But usually when you discover that, I'm sorry, you know, there is not an excuse for hitting her. And there's not an excuse for some of the control type stuff. This is the extreme end of it, and I think we've got to be careful. Sometimes the statistics, I think, do sort of include situations where there's a fairly equal fight between people that's going on within a situation, but usually that's not the level of violence you're talking about TV.
You mentioned that some of the strategies to deal with tackling domestic violence is in football clubs to how to get the players to talk and influence the player base and the fans. I think that's a great idea, but what are the other ways to deal with it that's kind of outside the context of, because sports is very mainstream Australian part of mainstream Australian culture. For those outside of this culture, such as Indigenous women and women of colour from migrant backgrounds and trans women, queer women, they have double the vulnerability, not only because of gender, but also because of their cultural backgrounds and ethnicities. So what are some viable strategies that can be used to approach these demographics?
Well, I'm just going to go back to education in schools on respectful relationships all the way through the curriculum. I think that's probably the most, will have the most influence in the long run.
Look, I think we've got to take a good long look at what we do to little boys and what we do to little girls in the beginning. I mean, years ago we used to actually worry about the fact that we stereotyped them. These days it happens all along. I mean, as I said, I keep quoting when I went to my grandson's, book story thing, that's about 18 months ago. Every girl was a princess or or a fairy, and every boy was a superhero or a wimpy kid. My grandson was a wimpy kid. But I mean, but you get to the point where you start stereotyping grade 3 kids in particular ways. And we start sort of running something which is actually there. And I mean, I don't know what they do with respectful relationships. I must say, I looked them up this afternoon and I was not impressed. I mean, I just think what we have to do is actually have a look at what we actually impose on children about what it is to be a boy and what it is to be a girl. And if you're transgender or various other things or come from different ethnic groups, you'll get mixed messages around that. But often it's the rigidity of girls have to be nice, so just don't tell them to fuck off because that's not ladylike. And boys are supposed to be tough, so just don't let anybody push you around. That once you've got those messages embedded through school and various other things, but as well sort of the attitude of parents and the assumptions about what little boys are supposed to do. Stand up for yourself, don't be a wuss, don't be this, don't be that, And for girls, don't get narky, don't be nasty, you've got to be nice, you've got to rescue people, you've got to be the soft one, you've got to be the things there. We need to take a look at how far those feed into bad relationships and victimhood in the later stage. What we want to do is give women the chance not to be victims and give men the chance not to be bullies. Basically, I mean, this is what we're talking about. And it's too bloody hard.
And vice versa.
And vice versa,
Just a little bit, the previous question alluded to the fact that we have such an ethnic mix now who arrive here with certain predetermined views as to the power sharing of family and relations and who calls the shots and who does what and when and all the rest of it. So, I mean, the Anglo-Saxons and those saints, as we all know, perhaps we have to almost look at tampering with the Y chromosome or something. But this is where, the whole mix, everything is more in your face now. It's tough. There's a certain essence of toughness, and so people resort, particularly those with a supremacy factor that they possess. And so, being a pessimist, perhaps the last 1200 years or so, there's always been a problem for the violence towards women. I don't know, but it's almost intractable, I would say, to cheer everyone up.
Yes, well, with an attitude like that, we're not going to get very far, are we? maybe you ought to have a serious think about your own masculinity worries if that's what you think.
Well, he wasn't saying it was his opinion.
No, but if you say, but saying it's an intractable issue, I think it just feeds into the idea that there's something basically there that you can't change.
I mentioned the chromosome.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I actually, at the risk of being a pessimist myself, I agree. I mean, I've been a bit perplexed about, there's been a lot of media lately about stop domestic violence, as in stop it.
Yes.
Like not reduce it, but stop it. And I think, well, no, surely it's far too great and far too complex to completely eradicate it. And if we think we've eradicated it, we've probably just driven it back underground, actually. So I partly agree. I think it's as sure as the fact that people have relationships that you're always going to have power and control. It's really about reducing it. And that doesn't mean that it's okay, it's just probably more realistic. We want to significantly reduce it, and we want to make it safer for people to talk about it and to get help when they need to, and to not be breeding, you know, little perpetrators. So we can aim for a very humane society. We can really polish the humanity that we have and that we show each other. But will we ever stop it? It's hard to imagine.
I agree, and I think the idea of stopping domestic violence again is an absurd slogan. It's like stopping violence generally. We're not going to, but what we can do is create a culture where it is discussed, open, aware and changing, and where it is not something which gets hidden, which gets assumed to be intractable. Because we know that it's not necessarily intractable. We know in some countries it's much lower than it is in other places. We know that there's, you know, that if you've got a more open society, and you've got a more egalitarian society, you're less likely to have people who are going to be angry with the world around them. So, I mean, I think there's a whole lot of issues that come out with that, and I think there's a whole lot of issues which men do find hard to deal with. You know, losing jobs, losing sort of legitimacy, losing things of that sort. But we need different ways of trying to deal with them than the current thing, which tends to be, you know, the sort of shoulder shrug, which was what I was reacting to beforehand, or whether it's just always going to be with us, when it does change, and it can change, and, you know, and I think we've got to be able to sort of say we can mitigate it, but we can't get rid of it.
I have an ideologically unsound biography. The main perpetrator of violence and control in our household was my very aggressive, domineering mum, who terrorised the lot of us. My dad was a complete doormat, and although I was the oldest, I was the wimpy kid who liked to have his head in the between the covers of the 1911 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I was regularly beaten, and there were all sorts of hysterical screamings and so on. I think that the issue does come down to dominance, control. Oh, and all the people who've reminded me of my mum subsequently have tended to be aggressive, dominant males. But aggressive, dominant persons of whatever gender. And this has left me with a lifelong antipathy to that kind of behaviour. As a small child, I had two wishes. One was that the rest of the world could see what was happening between Mum and the rest of us. The conviction that it would not withstand the light of day. The other was just a wish that it would stop. Oh, and a wish for a refuge. A refuge would have been wonderful.
I have another. When I came to Australia in the beginning of the 80s, I find the place was much more gentle. And surely there'd be some domestic violence and other violence. But now that you've worked hard, women who have worked hard, there are refugees and whatever you're saying, there's still or maybe not much difference in the level of violence. Because I think you move in one direction, but the culture, that's my impression from it. It became more violent by itself. And I remember 10 years ago, even more, I look at some video played on a computer that our colleague was, and it was so violent. It's just those moving human type things, and from time to time they were hit by what the guy was doing, and it was like a blood splashing over. You know, I just thought this sick. For me, it was like watching really some kind of murder, but the guy just did it. And I've heard there's many more such games, and they are kind of interesting. When I was in India, I was asking what boys, why are they watching such violent films? And they said, well, because it's interesting. So the violent films, they attract attention. There's something interesting there, and the violence is there and probably impacts on people.
People often spend a lot of time sort of trying to sort of claim that violent games and things like that do actually affect violence. There's been a lot of research, and they have not found that. They found that people who tend to be attracted to the games tend to be people who are attracted to the violence. It's hard to find a causal link, and believe me, a lot of people have tried. I don't think we. I mean, I don't think we are more violent. If you look at crime rates and things like that, they're nearly all down, apart from some of the domestic and sort of interpersonal type stuff. But most forms of violence are down. Certainly, gun violence is down. Various other violence is down. But, you know, I just think we do need to sort of accept, you know, look at the fact as to why that sort of particular interpersonal violence that happens in homes just doesn't seem to shift very much. And that's what the sort of intransigent issues are.
But would you agree that there is more violence in the air somehow?
No. As a sociologist, I'd say no. And that's my professional opinion.
That people are impatient, you know, it's not violence. Violent, but impatient on the public transport. Yes.
Road rage.
It doesn't come up in the States.
Yes, sure.
Can I ask another question? Did I get the idea that there's no statistics at all that has come out of women's refuges over the last 40 years? Like even just administrative ones.
Okay. It's a pity this is being filmed.
Do you want me to stop filming?
No, because then it looks like there's something to hide.
Not if I cut out the bit where you say it looks like there's something to hide.
No, it's okay. One of the things that we were quite surprised. No, I don't work in a women's refuge. No, so I work in health, and we have to count everything, and we have to try to measure everything, and we're constantly assessing is what we're doing working. I think women's refuges see that what they're doing is working, because I mean, how often, and I think I can feel this, you know, do this pretty safely. How often have you heard that there have been people murdered or killed, or you know, really terrible stories that have happened around women's refuges? I mean, they are safe places, and they see women move to safety. They envelop women within a caring network and coordinate the care around that woman or that family, through to secure housing and employment and training and so on. It's not just a bed. So that's what they do, that's what they see. And they've counted numbers, to be crude, you know, number of women a year, number of bed nights and all of that. That's how they count. But we were quite surprised last year that we couldn't, when we started advocating, that there wasn't fantastic evidence about why women's refuges work and what they actually achieve. I mean, we just knew they moved people through a terrible time to safety, but no, they didn't. They hadn't been collecting a lot of evidence, and unlike women's health centres as well, they haven't been accredited. So women's health centres and other community services have for years been through an accreditation or a quality improvement system, and women's refuges haven't been. So I think, in a sense, they've been really let down by that, because the stories that they can tell are extraordinary, and really it's hard to keep dry eyes through with the stories. But do they actually have concrete evidence? No, they haven't.
Are there any statistics about how much domestic violence happened before the women's movement. I mean, women's refuges started in the 70s. Here we've got the women's movement. Before that, do we have any information? It certainly wasn't the public issue it is now. So, perhaps at that time, the power balance between men and women was accepted by women. But the women's movement has given women alternatives. So now we hear about it, because now women can have counselling, there are refuges, they can leave, they can take their children, they can buy a house. There is an alternative for women now. They don't have to accept what was. And this is an enormous change in the culture. And that must affect the way men... I mean, one of the first things I remember hearing when I first got involved with the women's movement was that power is a material thing. If women gain some power, men lose it. And that's a very... I'm not justifying it, but I'm saying this is part of the culture that we're talking about changing.
I don't know, Eva would know more, but I'm thinking we don't know how prevalent it was before the women's movement, because it was very underground. I mean, now we do talk about it, a lot of people don't talk about it, a lot of people, even in this room, would have had experience of it in their families and don't want to, you know, choose not to discuss it because it is still, it's quite loaded, I think, and very personal. But things like the single... Yeah. Yes, yes. But it was really under... a little bit too young, but only just. But it was really underground.
Yeah.
You know, very, very hidden. And also, and I think this is something that I've seen in my lifetime, is that now it's not considered such a private matter. So if you would have heard stories of people phoning the police. They overhear something that's happening in their neighbourhood or as they're walking past or upstairs, and they phone the police. Well, 40 years ago, people would just say it's a private matter, don't get involved. And I think we're much more nosy these days. So that's probably a good thing. But also the single parents benefit. What a remarkable thing that was.
Exactly.
So financial independence, and I partly agree with the fellow who mentioned money before and pay parity, because I do think that's a really big issue. If you have money, if you have access to money, you have options that you don't otherwise have. Might not be the panacea, might not be the magic wand at all, because there's a lot else that's involved in that relationship. But if you do have access to money, that's one thing dealt with. You don't have to be fearful of a life of poverty, right? And that is a real clincher for a lot of women.
Yeah, we started, or the women that started places like LC started it because there wasn't anything, because it was private, because the response was, this is not something that police have any dealings with, it was just regarded as normal. And we certainly changed it. That was one of the things we did. And yes, a lot more women are now in the workforce, which means there's been a shift in the sort of power balance. And a lot fewer men are in the workforce, which is something people don't realise. A lot of the sort of semi-skilled and unskilled jobs which were plentiful at one stage are gone. And some of the men that had those jobs find it really hard to find jobs these days. And so, those issues come up. I think a lot of men still feel very threatened by the sort of women's movement, so judging by some of the commentaries and things that there are around. There's a lot of men who sort of feel somehow or other they've been deballed by the system. And bitches like me are sort of running around undermining things, and the family law courts have sort of deprived them of their children. There's a lot of people out there that have quite strong resentments about what's happened over the last 30 to 40 years. And, we've also, as I say, coarsened the society, I think, a lot with the whole neoliberal stuff, where the whole economic thing has ended up dominating a lot of the debates, so that we don't have the idea of collective care of kids and various other things, and community and so on, which was much stronger in those days. So there are trends which isolate families more and which make people more vulnerable. At the same time, as women being in the workforce has made an enormous difference to the fact that they can manage those things there. And I think that's one of the things that is sad. It's just sad that we are sort of at this stage, I suppose, what, the reason I'm sort of trying to raise some of these issues is that we seem to be on a loop where we keep going round and round the same issues, round and round the same reports, and round the same gaps. And somehow or other, I think we need to move past that.
I'm appalled at the amount of domestic violence that I hear about, but unfortunately, fortunately, I've never experienced it, and I find it very hard to understand. This might be a simplistic question, but are there ever any signs before people get married that they're likely going to end up in a violent relationship? Are there predictors?
They're in love.
Surely people don't change overnight just because they got married.
No. There are predictors if you're aware of them, and I think most of us would know people, maybe even ourselves, who family or friends might have warned them about somebody, right? It starts with things like wanting you, I'll say him because often it is a him, but that other person wanting you to themselves, so wanting him to yourself, to himself, sorry, asking you where you are all the time, ringing constantly, text messaging constantly, commenting, oh, you don't look good in that, you shouldn't go out wearing that, I don't like it when you wear that, or you've put on a bit of weight, like lots and lots of comments. So not one thing in isolation, but a picture builds. And quite classically, along with all of that is, I don't think your mother likes me, or I don't like that friend of yours. I don't know what it is about them, I just don't like them so much. So before you know it, if you're experiencing that behaviour, you're feeling self-conscious, you're feeling that maybe you're a bit overweight or underweight, or that you shouldn't wear that particular type of skirt, those shoes, shouldn't have your hair done that way, shouldn't go to that place, and I can't hang around that particular friend or those friends because he doesn't like them. He thinks that they don't like him, and so it'll be with a lack of evidence as well. You can ask your friends, oh, don't you like him? And they'll be like, no, he's all right, or oh, it seems that, it would be indifference usually. So there'll be a sense of isolating you, lessening your self-confidence, controlling your movements, and isolating. And they are the predictors. They are the predictors. And then it can just become more and more invasive.
And I think that's what we need to start talking about, rather than the deaths, rather than the actual serious violence, because often this becomes the background stuff to that sort of violence. And I just think we've got to recognise that it's that sort of control factor that very often becomes the real indicator. And the other problem is that women think they can fix it. If only he's more so,
You can't fix it.
I know.
I'm going to say there's another one, so it's all coming to me. No one understands you like I do. Yeah, no one. I really understand you. So it's all very seductive, isn't it? This person understands you better. But also what we call in the business is the boiled frog syndrome. You don't just meet someone and they whack you in the face. Very, very, very rarely, because they know what the reaction's going to be. So it's the boiled frog. You put a frog in a saucepan full of water and you slowly raise the temperature, slowly raise it, until the frog is just too seduced and hot to jump out. So you don't notice that it's happening at first. And then women start to minimise it and, oh no, that's just what he's like, or he didn't have a very good upbringing, or, making excuses. Yeah.
More and more lately, when we come together and discuss these sorts of matters, there's a reference to the government, appealing to the government, appealing to the government for funding and so on. Whereas when I was a child, work in education, so it was the department, and it was to the professional leaders of the department that decisions along the lines that you're talking about were made, not by the minister. And in social welfare, it seems to me, there is this movement towards appealing to the government, and is that a change that should be reversed back to the way it used to be?
I'm not sure what you mean and what it used to be. I mean, as far as I know, the government has always been a funder of services.
Not the decider of what the services will be. The government hasn't always been the way, certainly in education, the government hasn't decided what the curriculum is, to the extent that they do now. And in a way, it's a question is that's what has been happening in social welfare, the way I've seen it.
I think part of the problem is now that we've actually got rid of a lot of the NGO and community sector by actually making them servants of the state, and that's been pretty toxic. A lot of them are under government contracts, whereas once upon a time you used to actually get money from the government to help you do what you wanted at school, rather than the other way around, and I think that that's a big change. But just very briefly on that sort of control factor type stuff, I think one of the problems that we just a fun thing that we do have to do, and I mean, I think it means that women also have to look at the fact that they quite often get themselves into the point of hoping that they can rescue people as well. You know, we socialise into the expectation we can rescue. So maybe that's also some work we need to do to sort of help women get out of there faster, rather than the hope that if only I changed my ways and was more strong, blah, 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 it would be all right, you know. Because that's, I think that becomes a big trap. He needs me, you know. Anyhow, thank you. I think we've come to
we're finished now. But can everybody thank Eva and Roxane?